Welcome to this CPD from Equitone, exploring the role of texture in architecture. The film is narrated by materials and colour expert Jim Biddulph, who's joined by poet, broadcaster and RIBA Honorary Fellow Lionheart. Talking texture. Are we texturally literate?
Hello, I'm Jim Biddulph and I'm going to be joined by poet, broadcaster and spoken word performer Lionheart to talk about texture in architecture. We'll be exploring several facets of texture, and this CPD will take around 45 minutes to complete, with opportunities for you to interact at the end of each short section using this hashtag. Our whistle-stop tour is going to look at texture from a few angles: psychology and ecology to start with, followed by a quick recap of some textural milestones in architectural history, and a glance at what's happening now with texture across related design disciplines, and of course, in architecture and the facades of buildings. Lionheart is tasked with asking the rather awkward question of how texture makes us feel, and we'll be taking a quick behind-the-scenes look at the design thinking and manufacturing processes behind Equitone's textures. But first of all, a question. Are we texturally literate?
All the senses, including vision, can be regarded as extensions of the sense of touch.
That was Finnish architectural theorist Juhani Palasma writing in 1996 and putting his finger on exactly why texture is so important to architectural expression. According to Palasma, it all goes back to early childhood and human cognitive development. We are sensory beings, and touch lies at the very first stage of our learning. As newborns, while our eyes are still processing a collage of blurred figures, our universal instinct is to touch. Touch is how we first discover the world. But do we actually have the words to describe the big wide world of texture? Are we as architects texturally literate? We're surprisingly adept as a culture at naming the visuals of colour: red, blue, taupe, teal, elephant's breath, tranquil dawn, kernel of truth. I could go on. And it's widely accepted that there can be both objective and subjective assessments of colour. Red is the colour of passion. It's a common trope in the Western world. But the colour might make you personally just feel hungry. Orange makes people happy, but in you, it could trigger the EasyJet check-in queue. Blue has a calming effect, but what if it's the colour of your rival team? It seems we're not so good at naming texture, and that we tend to be rather less eloquent about the sensations of touch. Here's a little test. Ask yourself or someone else, perhaps your boss, if you can name more textures than colours. Rough, smooth, coarse, slick. I won't wait. For the majority of us, the vocabulary is, it turns out, pretty inhibited. And for most designers, the aspects of visual expression are at the forefront of our minds when we design, rather than the rudiments of touch. So manipulating form and light, rhythm and proportion, colour and even pattern, the optical dimension of texture. But texture is, if you think about it, the only one of those facets with the potential to stimulate more than one of our senses at the same time. It's a multi-sensory phenomena, something we both see and feel, and perhaps even hear. Auditory roughness is a thing, just ask an acoustic consultant. Our senses collaborate when perceiving texture. It's also something inherent to do with building materials, regardless of whether they're machine-made or take the imprint of the human hand. And materials are not only the tectonic building blocks of architecture, but perhaps more significantly, represent the all-important interface between people and the built environments. How we read the exteriors of the buildings that together constitute our built environments is a massive factor in how we relate to and experience architecture. So texture is a vital but overlooked aspect of architectural language. In this CPD, we're going to investigate the meaning of texture in the round in relation to the buildings we design, and of course, inhabit. But how are we going to begin to figure out how textures make us feel on an emotional level? We'll find out. Was texture part of your educational experience?
Texture and the mind. Is texture all in the mind?
Plenty of philosophers have tried to pin down the precise nature of human responses to architecture and space. From Plato to Wittgenstein, Heidegger, Bachelard, and the texture is integral to the thinking of phenomenologists in architecture like Christian Norberg Schulz, for whom texture was an integral aspect of place. For Danish architect and theorist Stein Ila Rasmussen, it was fundamental and something he devoted an entire chapter of his influential Experiencing Architecture to in 1957, along with a chapter on hearing architecture. The interesting thing about texture in this respect is that multi-sensory quality we've discussed. Texture is something literally felt by touch, but also perceived and experienced visually. And these are both things that science has been measuring for some time. What researchers are now increasingly focusing on is how texture is perceived in the round, on an emotional level, when those senses interact, something that's called embodied cognition. The idea that the mind is not only connected to the body, but that the body influences the mind. Like holding a hot drink makes people rate strangers as warmer and more caring or generous. From a neurological perspective, information about texture is transmitted from sensors in the skin and through the nerves to the somatory sensory cortex, the part of the brain responsible for intercepting the sense of touch. New research shows that as neurons in this part of the brain process this information, they each respond differently to various features of a surface, creating a high-dimensional representation of texture in the brain. Different kinds of nerve fibers respond to different aspects of texture. Some nerves respond best to coarser textures, like the raised bumps of braille letter that create a pattern when pressed against the skin. Others respond to vibrations created when the skin rubs across a fine surface texture, like fabric. The focus on using science to figure out and quantify emotional responses to architecture and texture is interesting. A group of researchers in Australia is in fact calling for post-occupancy evaluations that measure the impact of the built environments on emotional states, and not just the physical and environmental factors. Or take the Space for Being collaboration with Johns Hopkins University Arts and Mind Lab at Milan Design Week in 2019, when Google were attempting to corner a market in the relatively new discipline of neuroaesthetics, an experimental field that uses neuroscience to understand and explain aesthetic experiences and responses to art, objects and environments at a neurological level.
Those things as designers we intuit, neuroscience is now proving have an effect. I really believe that form follows feeling, and feeling is really what space and architecture are about.
Those are two quotes from some of the people behind the project. What the project was doing was an attempt to measure the impact of design, including texture, in a new way of capturing data in the form of specific physical and physiological responses. It presented three very different spaces designed to evoke diverse emotional responses through variations in texture, colour and lighting. Visitors wore specially designed wristbands that captured heart and respiratory activity, skin conductance, temperature and body motion. At the end of the experience, visitors received a customised report suggesting which space they felt most comfortable and at ease in, based on their real-time physiological responses. We usually think we know what we feel, I think, but for the first time people were able to see hard evidence in real time of how their bodies were responding to the experiences of sensory aspects in design, including, of course, textural qualities. So is texture all in the mind? The answer seems to be yes and no. What we don't know is if the visitors to the exhibition agreed with Google's personalised algorithms, if the feelings matched the thoughts. But what can be extrapolated with certainty from the point of view of architecture is that this is the beginning of a whole new way of evaluating environments and space in relation to well-being, and that texture is likely to play a big part in that. By the way, did you know that the reason virtual meetings are more cognitively tiring than actual ones is because we have to concentrate more to make up for the lack of physical, or shall we say textural, signals? Something to think about. Can you identify a textural trigger that creates an emotional response?
Texture and the natural world. Does the language of texture originate in nature?
Let's begin at the beginning, with evolution.
It is not the strongest of the species that survives, not the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that is the most adaptable to change.
The natural world is brimming with examples of texture. We know that from Darwin. And we know that texture in nature is the result of millions of years of evolution, and that it continues to exist because it serves a whole host of ecologically vital, intrinsically interconnected functions. These might be to protect, to camouflage, to shelter, to attract, to identify just a few, and in many ways are parallel to the function of a building's facade. Think about it like Charles and Ray Eames zooming back in from outer space in The Powers of Ten to the Chicago lakeside and that sleeping man on the picnic blanket with the hairs on the back of his hand. Look at that expanse of lawn and look closer at that blade of grass. Or visualize the whole structure of a tree and then the fine detail of the smooth surface leaf with its underside of microscopic stomata that actually exist to absorb carbon dioxide and release oxygen, helping us all to breathe. It's all connected. Actually, tree bark is quite a good example of why texture exists in nature. Like our own skin in many ways and essential for survival, helping the tree to conserve and distribute water and nutrients, protecting from environmental and situational dangers. We also know that not all trees are the same, that the bark of different species is going to vary in response to different ecosystems and climates, that the smooth pale of a silver birch exists to reflect sunlight and protect from damaging ultraviolet rays, but the dark corrugated bark of Scots pine help to protect against wildfire. Texture in nature, like everything in nature, serves a purpose. What's pertinent here is that when we step back and zoom out again from that iconic square of picnic blanket by the Chicago lakeside, we can see that multiple textures coexist at different scales of perception, all together at the same time. Everything's connected. And that for us as humans, the contrasting textures and scales create a sensually stimulating and aesthetically harmonious environment. We could even call it an ecology of texture. One of the reasons that now, in the 21st century, architects continue to reference nature and natural materials in their work is that user research and post-occupancy evaluation is consistently showing that people respond positively to those environments, with improved reported feelings of well-being. Sustainability assessment methods for buildings such as BREEAM and WELL are increasingly focusing on ways of measuring human experiences of buildings, while the recently set up Quality of Life Foundation takes a similar human-focused and evidence-based viewpoint, asking people how they feel about architecture and their built environments. What else might explain in our smooth digital age the resurgence of popular interest in highly textured and béton brut architecture? Could it be, by any chance, something to do with that all-important contact touch with nature? What natural textures do you use in your practice?
Architecture and texture, a brief history. What's the story of texture in architecture?
Texture in architecture is, of course, as old as architecture itself. Just think of that old chestnut of Laguerre and his primitive hut, a reference in turn, of course, back to Vitruvius and his gnarled tree trunks of columns. But let's not do that conventional architectural thing of starting, for some reason, with ancient Greece and Rome. Let's start towards the end of the 19th century with a postman and outsider architect called Joseph Ferdinand Cheval, who spent 33 years of his life building his ideal palace in the southeast of France. The catalyst for this textural masterpiece was Cheval's experience on his daily post round of tripping over an unusually sculpted stone. And ultimately, his 26-metre long and 12-metre high palace caught the eye of fine artists Max Ernst, André Breton, Jacques Prévert and Picasso, all making the pilgrimage to the site in the 1920s and 30s. Chevall had started his project at around the same time that Gaudí was working on designs for the Sagrada Familia, and it's never really been established if that was, in fact, a coincidence. As we know, there was plenty of textural exuberance going on in architecture in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And we know that Ruskin was a big fan of highly textured Gothic ornament in architecture. And that the reason he valued it was because he saw it as an expression of the artisan's fulfillment in work of the kind that actually allowed thinking and expression. Whether you think of yourself as an artisan or a white-collared professional, whether you're into Pomo or minimalism, there is something compelling about Ruskin's argument.
We want one man to be always thinking, and another to be always working, and we call one a gentleman and the other an operative, whereas the workman ought often to be thinking, and the thinker often to be working.
It was probably Adolf Loos who sounded the first death knell for all of that exuberance. His famous essay, Ornament and Crime, was published in 1913, and it seeded the idea that some forms of ornamentation were almost morally offensive in architecture, a bit like built-in obsolescence. His views, sort of aligned with William Morris's thinking, went on to influence the Bauhaus design studio, which of course went on to be instrumental in defining the ideology of architecture's modernism. The international style pioneers in the 1920s and 30s were particularly concerned with flat and smooth surfaces in architecture, with Mies famously declaring in 1947, "Less is more." A parallel and related development, of course, was in concrete as we know it today. In the 19th century, concrete's use was restricted to mainly industrial buildings, and the first house using reinforced concrete was actually a servant's cottage in England built by William B. Wilkinson in 1854. Since then, the concrete aesthetic, whether plastic or rugged, has become an integral part of the landscape of architecture. Of course, not everyone started out or even stayed on the same smooth path. Corbusier is obviously a good example of an architect who started to reintroduce a textural sensibility into his work, almost doing a U-turn in terms of texture in later projects like Ronchamp and Chandigarh. To me, Robert Venturi's quip back at Mies in 1966, "Less is a bore," sort of sums up what can be seen as an ongoing tussle in architecture, which is partly a battle between the rough and the smooth, between textured expression and the super sleek visions of those international style boys, who, let's face it, perhaps found texture in the environment a bit of a sensory overload. And so, bearing all these influences in mind, where have the Miesian forces of the international style led us? Which historic texture would you revive?
Texture in design now. What does texture mean today, and what are other design disciplines doing with it?
The digital era has delivered us convenience, and our virtual worlds are certainly a lot more higher definition than they once were. We have the ability to print out textured 3D reality at the touch of a button. Haptic communication is a big thing. We all do it every time we engage with a handheld device, or a door handle for that matter, what our old friend Palasma once described as the handshake of the building. Architects, of course, have been thinking about these things in an intuitive way for centuries. But in some industries, CMF, that's colour, materials, finish, is now a design stage in its own right, all about determining how something already designed looks, feels and behaves in relation to its surface qualities, and is considered by manufacturers to be a significant factor in determining a product's value. In architecture, we're getting to grips with the implications of VR and now AR on how we design and think about spaces and environments. A big question, of course, is what will that mean for texture? Because AR brings us the capacity to combine real-world virtual experiences in the design process, potentially across multiple senses, not just visual and auditory, but haptic and also somatosensory and olfactory. But is digitisation, paradoxically, acting as a driver for more texture in the real world? If you think about it, that might partly explain Gen Z's love of pot plants. It's all connected. Perhaps this is a good point to glance sideways to see what's going on with texture in non-digital design disciplines. Studio Swine is a practice straddling the spheres of sculpture, installation and cinema. They blend poetry and research into immersive experiences such as Infinity Blue, a 9-metre tall breathing, unolfactory sculpture for the Eden Project in Cornwall. It's a vast salute to the invisible life forms that provide the oxygen in air. On the surface of the monument, Cornish clay and oxidised glazes express local mining history in a textural pattern generated by a reaction diffusion algorithm found across nature from zebras to coral. Dutch garden designer Piet Odulf, he was the unsung plant designer of the New York High Line, has described texture as architecture of the plant, which importantly he also likens to character in a human being.
When you meet a person and you see their body language or expression, you know if it's someone you like or don't like. It's the same with plants.
This resonates with the observation at the start of this CPD that touch is how we first discover the world. And it reinforces the idea that texture is a quality, at least partly, perceived on a highly intuitive level. We usually know whether we like a person or not, or a building for that matter, almost straight away. What we don't always know is why. But more on that later from Lionheart. Or take the work of young British artist Daniel Cruz-Chubb, whose thick impasto paintings were a sellout success story of 2020's online-only Frieze Art Fair, one of the few presentations to sell out. Which is ironic really, because the paintings couldn't be more different from the digital format of the lockdown. His patchwork canvases with their slashed surfaces and stapled layers are very much about texture. Here's what he has to say.
In a way, I'm a reactionary. My surfaces are a reaction against the flatness of a digital image. They corrode the boundary between sculpture and painting.
If painting's too abstract for you, what about stop frame animation? Dan Richards is director at A&C Studios, working in the old school form, and he says that it's the handcrafted nature of the studio's output that sets it apart from what is now a largely digitised industry. His take on the enduring popularity and appeal of stop frame also relates to that thing called texture.
We always use the word texture as a description in itself. What we mean is that you can see the surface finish and almost feel it.
Almost feel it. Now there's a thought. Texture is integral too to textile design. Texture, textile, same Latin root. Textile and knit designer Zoe Miller has an interesting observation about the textural appeal of her craft, describing the visual quality of her work as important, but the haptic element as vital. She also says something that might be of interest to those of you who value analogue model making as part of your design practice in our increasingly digitally orientated world.
I could never design fabrics solely on a screen or piece of paper. The design development only comes through iterations of making.
And that, of course, brings us back to Ruskin.
The workman ought often to be thinking, and the thinker often to be working.
Would you encourage people to touch your buildings?
Feeling texture. How does texture make us feel?
It would be fair to say that the intention behind the presentation of a material in architecture, specifically its texture, is where the narrative begins to give rise to our emotional response.
Buildings never leave us cold.
Texture makes us feel different. It depends on who we are. And I say that because it communicates a sensory understanding that is either conditioned, ingrained in us, or it starts a new feeling that we hadn't explored before and now slowly working its way into our neurological understanding, right? So texture for me is an informative resource. How we engage with that depends on our education.
Materials, and by extension textures, tell narratives, and often our experiences confirm our expectations. But there are a few noticeable moments of surprise and intrigue where touching the material opens us to a feeling that we didn't expect.
I would say most architects are only comfortable talking about texture when you give them an incentive to. So in my residencies, what I love to do is essentially get under the skin, and I give them a question. So the question is, describe the person you love as a building or interior space. And I could ask you a plethora of questions before that, texture wouldn't come up. Only when describing the partner or someone that they wish to love, it's an environment which they're so meticulous and pedantic about, they go to every finite detail and texture comes into it then. And it's usually soft. It's usually something which is reactive to a person, to a touch. And that's very indicative to the type of love that they want. We kind of miss that quality in texture a lot of the time. It's usually this very stoic force that we have to find our way through, or it just says, this is how I am, learn how to respond to me in that environment. But when describing someone that they love, that's when texture takes a whole different life of its own.
There are many within the built environment who herald significant moments in their childhood for shaping their relationship with texture and materiality. Although this awareness is often moulded by subsequent years in their profession, it highlights the fact that the initial induction to touch matters.
There's an instinctual emotion infused into why you describe the things the way they are. There's meaning there, there's purpose there, there's experiential behavior now that's associated with what material you're going to use. And essentially, if I was to ask them any question which is a textbook question, they would have premeditated answers. They're trained to a certain point to have those responses, to maybe tick a box or maybe to seem like, okay, they've done their research, they've done their history. But when it comes to an innovative question that requires them to tap into their emotional archive, you get texture, because touch is something that we feel emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. Touch doesn't have to be a thing where you physically, it's tangible, it's an emotive quality as well.
A surface's textural quality, be that its shine, reflectiveness, its depth, its interplay with light, its results on acoustics, its tactility, its richness, whether it's natural, manipulated, man-made or formed, will impact on how a space is experienced. It may impact different users in different ways and communicate different things. Even if a final material surface is chosen to be left in its natural state, that should still be seen as a deliberate act to evoke a particular feeling or experience of a space.
It would be fair to say that the intention behind the presentation of a material in architecture, specifically its texture, is where the narrative begins to give rise to our emotional response.
I believe that architects need to look at our emotional cognitive behavior as an asset. Once we learn how to treat it as an asset, it can affect a plethora of features in our human experience. So learning how materials, how textures can elicit a certain emotion now becomes an asset, now becomes a tool that they can equip themselves with to achieve a certain emotional journey in a space, that can achieve a certain sense of well-being in a space. And until we know what that is, until that information is at our hips and we know, okay, we can go to it right now, it's there, it's ready, apply it, we're always gonna have these spaces which hopefully affect someone in the way we want. That hopefully, we can presume or assume that they're gonna feel this way in that situation or occurrence. But when you know finitely you can achieve this, it will allow people's experiences to be more guaranteed. You buy a product, you're guaranteed this after 2 years, you can guarantee that experience no matter what.
During a 2018 interview at Grimshaw, it was remarked that architects are often the manipulators of claustrophobia, unanimously flooring many in the profession due to its humour and pinpoint delivery. It reveals the masterful ability the profession has to make decisions on how to affect the feeling of those who interact or inhabit said spaces.
The future is going to be completely different than how it is currently, and I think it requires a certain understanding of cultural relevance. And now understanding how mental health has affected us since the beginning of COVID-19, and it's affected so much into the world of design, the world of architecture, the world of the built environment. We now have to have spaces which take into account how we feel, how we emotionally immerse ourselves into those locations. Now, how does texture play a part in that? How does the application of texture play a part in that? What are the social, psychological dynamics in response to that texture with different cultural partners or beings or people? Like, how can we now revolve our understanding of texture in terms of our emotional inhabitants. And once we understand that, the future is ours to mold. Now, for me, like one of my aims is to one day turn a poem into an installation, right? So you can walk through a poem. But in walking through that poem, understanding the finite responses to an individual in that space is so important for me, because I don't want to just create a space that you walk through, oh, I feel better. Why? What feelings have I pinpointed in you to actually make you leave that place a different person? That's key for me. To touch is to immerse. Each material's surface is as deep as our ability to translate its messaging. Both eyes and skin are literate in feelings, each understand texture, touched, a tour guide of our senses, an intangible depth made tangible, to signal a sensation of connection, an ocean swam with perceptiveness, waters which choose you.
What is your earliest textural memory?
Texture and architectural expression. What does texture say in architecture?
You might have seen that TED Talk from New York Magazine music and architecture critic Justin Davidson. If you haven't, it's worth a 10-minute watch. There's a link at the end of the presentation. But basically, Davidson is making a pretty impassioned plea for more texture in architecture, what he calls the touchable city. And the reasons he's got a problem with cities becoming even smoother and glassier are interesting. For him, it's not really about aesthetics. He doesn't have a problem with glass or glass architecture per se. What he's really concerned about is the homogenizing effect of virtually all glass cities and the impact it's having upon people and societies.
Think about what we lose when architects stop using the full range of available materials. We simplify architecture and we impoverish cities.
What happens, he says, when a city defaults to glass is that it becomes a hall of mirrors, disquieting and cold. For him, what big assemblies of glass towers are actually communicating is disdain for the civic and communal aspects of urban life, enriching the lives of owners and tenants, but impoverishing the lives of ordinary people on the ground. Killing off public space is pretty strong stuff.
Buildings create the spaces around them, and those spaces can draw people in or push them away.
Davidson is a big advocate of materials with local significance. And the interesting thing about that is it doesn't have to preclude modern methods of construction. These woven willow panels set within steel frames are for the Northstowe project in the Cambridge Fens, shortlisted in 2020 for the Offsite Awards and a testing bed for new and more contextual and textural approaches in volumetric construction. The composite canopy combines waterproof transparent cladding on the upper face with the textured hurdles as a soffit below, filtering daylight and providing wind and rain shelter for an external workspace below. It references regional coppicing and weaving traditions and also makes use of local skills, with textured character continued in the building's facade with references to Roman pottery shards from nearby archaeological digs. Here's another contextual, textural facade. It's Caruso St John's Nottingham Contemporary in the historic lace-making city, and the pattern cast into the surface of the precast concrete panels is from lacework found in a time capsule. The casting was done by making positives out of CNC milled MDF, which were then used to create two 14-metre-long hard latex casts. Again, what this building is communicating is a sense of contextual continuity without being hidebound by heritage. A heritage context of limestone buildings was the inspiration behind the refracted planes of textured cladding on this public WC block. It's for the medieval Cahir Castle in Tipperary, Ireland, and architects Dayton Lesat used Equitone's linear to emphasise the lines of the building's complex geometry with plays of perspective, light and shadow further enhanced by non-orthogonal jointing. And this new building in Upper Street, Islington, by Amir Tahan's group work, references context in a different way. It's actually coloured concrete. It's in a conservation area and replaces a bomb-damaged building that was inadequately rebuilt after World War II. The elevations are based on historic photographs and were effectively cast in 1.2 metre high bandings of polystyrene formwork. What's interesting is the way it exaggerates inherent flaws in the digital manufacturing process, making a thing of imperfect transitions between analogue and digital. I wonder what Ruskin would have made of that. Visual texture was the main goal behind this Studio Weave pavilion for Clerkenwell Design Week. It housed an exhibition on the making of various skills of the smiths of the city guilds, and spaces for showcasing contemporary craft making in workshops and demonstrations. It used linear to communicate its message on texture. Touch contact is the thing at this nursery in Edinburgh. It uses texture to provide a haptic learning environment for curious and imaginative play in preschool-aged children. It's by Anderson, Bell and Christie and uses two contrasting equitone materials, linear and natura, to articulate the building in texture, generating tactile interaction on a child's scale while being low on visual noise. This one is both contextual and anti-contextual. It's a pavilion for Design Week Mexico 2019. And what the designer Geraldo Brosson is commenting on is the three-way tension in architecture today between rational and parametric forces and the natural environment. Its jigsaw puzzle-like walls and bulbous extrusions are in two equitone materials. Or what about a structure that takes its kinetic form and texture from human movement itself? Urban Imprint is a project by artist, engineer and designer Nacia Iglesias for ADO in New York. Her starting point is never material, form or technique, but cognitive experience or interaction. And in this project, she investigates an urban environment, not of static materials, but ones responsive to humans.
When we live mostly in this digital realm, our self has no physical context. Yet by decoupling from the physical reality, we also lose our ability to be present and experience the world through the full palette of our senses.
What would you express with texture?
Creating texture. How are equitone textures conceived and made?
Before we get to the nitty-gritty of how you can create diverse textures working with equitone, I'm going to do a whistle-stop recap of the main processes employed to create texture in architecture. Bush hammering is a traditional technique which uses a bush hammer to create texture in stone and concrete, either using a hand tool or a machine. The tool has a grid of conical points at the end of a large metal slug which is impacted on the surface to create a rough pockmark effect resembling weathered rock. Béton brut is a French term which translates as raw concrete and is used to describe concrete that is left unfinished after being cast, often displaying the seams and textures imprinted on it by the formwork. Concrete can be cast to create complex shapes and textures that would otherwise be difficult to make. Cast can be metal, timber, or even textile. Surfaces can be carved using a range of tools, creating diverse effects from chiseling and other percussion techniques to laser and diamond cutting. In terms of bespoke texture, carving is a high investment, high reward bespoke approach. Mechanically grinding a surface to create a honed and polished surface, often using abrasives in order to refine the surface to desired finish. A more economical approach in which texture is impressed into wet concrete using a stamp, often to resemble traditional building materials such as brick or natural stone. Bearing all this textural information in mind, it's now time to understand the research and development behind the equitone range and how architects collaborate in the new product development process and the textures available to you in the material range, and how you can adapt them to create your own individual designs. When Ludwig Hatzek invented fibre cement board in the late 19th century, he combined the basic elements of the earth, mineral materials, water, air, and fire in the form of heat, in a simple infiltration process. Since 1905, Equitone has continued this legacy with the development of the brand's iconic fibre cement material ranges. But what is fibre cement and how is it made? In the 1950s, leading architect Walter Gropius pioneered the use of coated fibre cement panels using the ventilated facade system, which we now call a rain screen facade. Designer Willy Gould created the famous loop chair from one piece of fibre cement in 1954. These design innovations embodied the core qualities of the fibre cement-based material: thin and light, yet indestructible and sometimes beautiful. In 1987, Herzog and de Meuron designed the Ricola storage building in Laufen using uncoated fibre cement panels. The resulting shutter facade inspired Etex to start the industrial development of raw, untreated fibre cement materials. Today, Equitone has a full range of through-coloured, untreated fibre cement materials developed by and made for architects. Fibre cement is a versatile composite material that consists of cement, cellulose and mineral materials reinforced by a visible matrix. Once the cellulose, fillers and fibres have been mixed with the water, the sheets are rolled and pressed to extract excess moisture. The mixture remains pliable for a short time after it's formed, so it can be shaped into anything from small tiles to planks to large format panels. Equitone has a range of materials, some of which already have textural surfaces. Equitone Linear is a unique 3D shaped, through-coloured material that has a linear ridge surface which plays with light and shadow. Fibre cement offers a huge amount of design flexibility. Equitone's fibre cement panels can be subjected to very precise fabrication techniques: routed, CNC cut, perforated, and even embossed or printed, offering enormous potential to develop a textural and unique surface. What texture would you like to see incorporated?
Summary.
So where does all this talk of texture take us? And what have we learnt about texture in terms of our own perceptions and design practice? We've looked at the complexity of neurological perception and the impact texture has on the brain. We know that responses to texture aren't just triggered by a touch sensor that sends an impulse message, although that's part of it. We've found that texture is perceived through a sophisticated mix of physical, social, and emotional responses combining in a highly nuanced picture, one which has unsuspected depths and impacts on our well-being. We've discovered that the huge variety of textures prompt rich and diverse emotional responses, one which can trigger memory and also physical responses. And we've considered the role that texture plays in embodied cognition, the idea being that the mind is not only connected to the body, but that the body influences the mind, although scientists haven't completely unravelled how this works yet. It's interesting territory, and it touches closely on architecture and designing buildings for human occupation, in whatever form that might take, be it a hospital, a school, workplace or hotel room. We also hope that we've created a platform for you to build on with our whistle-stop tours of the evolution of texture in nature and architectural history. We've seen how textures in design are evolving in interesting and unprecedented ways in the real world, and we've looked at how the virtual world is increasingly embracing references to nature and natural experiences. It's no surprise that the immersive digital technologies such as Unreal Engine, which supports real-time digital tools for designers across the creative industries, are constantly updating their palettes of tools with even more realistic and geographically specific surfaces, plants, liquids, and textural effects. These virtual tools are enhancing our ability to mimic the real world as we design, prompting us to focus more than ever on human emotional responses. We hope that this has opened the door to the potential of texture to create emotional engagement in the built environment, as well as to the almost limitless possibilities for applying texture in architecture. And that includes using it to enhance accessibility and legibility in buildings. We've delved into the nitty-gritty of surface and explored methods for creating bespoke textures from traditional to the latest CNC machine technology. We hope that this CPD has more than scratched the surface of a fascinating subject and inspired you to want to experiment. Equitone, the product inspiring this CPD, is constantly pushing its research and development team with the support of architects like you to create surfaces to add to the palette of materials for use in facades. But as we've shown, Equitone is also very receptive to working with specifiers to create inspirational, bespoke designs in collaboration with fabricators who are excited to take on new textural challenges. This is one of the key messages we want you to take away today. If you've an idea on how to use one of our materials to create a textured surface for one of your projects, get in touch with us and we'll work our hardest with you and your fabricator to make it a reality.
We hope you've enjoyed this CPD from Equitone, and we look forward to seeing your responses to some of our questions on social media channels.